Day 2 of the United Nations General Assembly is now behind us, but the problems and major conflicts in the world continue. So what impact do the world's leaders gathering to express their concerns actually have on the situation? And where does the UN fall short in living up to the principles and values explicitly stated in its charter? To discuss this, we are now joined by former UNHCR Mission Head Robert van Leeuwen. Hello, sir, and thanks for joining us on World News Tonight.
Thank you, Don. Thank you very much for good evening, and thank you very much for having me on your program.
Yes, now, before I get to the criticism, so let's talk about this is the 79th United Nations General Assembly, and obviously we're in a new century. We have moved on from the Cold War. So if we look at what we've accomplished so far since the millennium, what do you think some of the greatest accomplishments of the United Nations are in this century?
I would say certainly among the greatest accomplishments are the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Goals and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that basically embodied the goals of the entire membership of the United Nations and mobilized action to achieve them, ranging from the elimination of poverty and hunger to climate change and so on. It's a very broad 17 goals. A good deal of progress has been made along the lines that were agreed upon.
Right, especially in eliminating poverty to a large extent, and therefore the United Nations has been very effective and successful there. But now when we look at the speeches that are being made, we have two major conflicts in the world, of course, the war in Ukraine, the situation in the Middle East. Many people have said the UN needs to be reformed in some ways, whether that be to the Security Council or whether it be to the institution as such. Why do you think it's such a problem for the United Nations to effectively deal with global conflicts?
Well, it's not a new subject. Just reflecting over the past decades, there have been many calls for United Nations reform, and particularly with regard to the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, compared to the limited ability to affect action of the UN General Assembly. That has been the focus, but these discussions go back a long way. And the reason they haven't made progress is not only has the world, of course, changed a great deal, but what has remained the same is essentially that governments will, as they always have, want to hang on to the power they have. And the veto power is an enormous one. We have one of the P5 members, Russia, which began a war of aggression in Ukraine in February 2022, and as a permanent member of the Security Council, exercised its veto against all measures to bring an end to hostilities that it had itself initiated.
And Ukraine has been calling for Russia to be suspended from the Security Council. Is that at all possible?
I doubt very much that is going to happen. Russia has been suspended from the United Nations Human Rights Council, but that is, of course, a very different matter. It's not likely to be suspended from the Security Council for the simple reason that the mechanisms to do that are very unlikely to be invoked. There's also a danger in suspending Russia from the Security Council, even though it is something that must be considered, and that is that that would cut off essentially important avenues of dialogue, even though those have been extremely unproductive so far.
President Zelensky made a scathing speech to the Security Council yesterday. really pretty much opening up with from the very first second of this war, he said Russia has been doing things that cannot possibly be justified under the UN Charter. Every destroyed city, every burned village. We've heard this time and time again from the Ukrainian president. How can this be reckoned with? Is the UN the right avenue for Ukraine to pursue this, or as they also say they're working on this independent peace conference in Switzerland, maybe round 2 with Russia at the table? How do you think that they should go about resolving this conflict?
Well, I think they have to pursue all avenues available to them, and I think President Zelensky is doing exactly that. This war of aggression has essentially been waged by Russia as a war against civilians. It has been civilians. There's ample evidence that civilians have been the target. The cities destroyed, the schools destroyed, the hospitals, the shopping malls destroyed, and so on. And in particular, the targeting of sources of energy, for example, prior to the winter setting in, which will put the population through extreme hardship. So it has been a war on civilians, and that is against all the principles of the United Nations, all the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It is international criminal behavior. Therefore, President Zelensky has, from the outset, I think, effectively produced all the avenues open to him in the international community, and the Security Council is one that, despite its inability to move beyond the Russian veto power in the Security Council, still has the General Assembly, which can be called into emergency session and has been called into emergency session to deal with the crisis in Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine. I myself, in fact, launched an initiative in early March of 2022, in which I submitted a white paper that was shared with the Ukrainian government and with others at the United Nations, to try and get certain text into United Nations General Assembly resolutions that would address this problem, such as, for example, a United Nations Commission on Ukraine, such as we had when the Korean War occurred, which eventually led to the truce we still have in Korea, and a United Nations Emergency Protection Force in Ukraine, a peacekeeping force such as we had during the Suez Canal crisis, and we had as recently as during the crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And while parts of my text dealing with the protection of civilians made their way into the General Assembly resolution, those two teeth, as I would like to call them, in the proposed text were not adopted. And there are reasons for this. Many countries in the global south, I think, still consider the war in Ukraine to be a European problem, a problem of the rich countries to resolve among themselves, while they would prefer to have a different perspective on this.
Yes, well, we certainly would like to see some actions such as that. Robert van Leeuwen, former UNHCR Mission Head, thank you very much for joining me tonight and sharing your thoughts on this matter. I very much appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
My thanks to you.
And that's all the time we have on World News Tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time. Good night.